In 1863, U.S. troops killed 493 Shoshone in Cache Valley, including women and children, leaving only a fraction of the tribe alive, as local settlers counted the bodies. Chief Sagwitch, wrapped in a woven blanket and gripping a staff, had sought peace in Salt Lake City days before the 4-hour slaughter. Historian Brigham D. Madsen labeled it the deadliest military strike against Native Americans in the West. What sparked this devastation, and how does it expose the human toll of America's westward push? Watch to unravel the haunting truth. Cache Valley, known to the northwestern Shoshone as Willow Valley, stood as a vital lifeline for their people. This fertile expanse in northern Utah teemed with resources that sustained their way of life for centuries. Shoshone families fished for trout in the clear streams, gathered wild grains and grass seeds, and hunted an array of game, from small rabbits to massive bison, deer, and elk. According to ethnographer Julian Stewart, the Shoshone's deep knowledge of the valley's ecosystem allowed them to thrive in harmony with the land, their seasonal migrations ensuring its bounty endured. Their lodges, crafted from willow branches and hides, dotted the valley each winter, a testament to a culture rooted in balance. Yet, this sacred ground would soon become a stage for tragedy, as outsiders cast covetous eyes on its riches. The valley's allure drew fur trappers, rugged men like Jim Bridger and Jedediah Smith, who ventured into the region in the early 19th century. These trappers, clad in buckskin and wielding flintlock rifles, were struck by the valley's abundance. They named it Cache Valley after their practice of burying furs and supplies in hidden pits or caches to safeguard them for trade. Historian Dale L. Morgan notes that by the 1820s, trappers had established the valley as a key hub, using it as a base to hunt in the surrounding Bear and Wasatch Mountains. Bridger, a towering figure in frontier lore, reportedly described the valley as a paradise for its game and water, but their presence marked the beginning of a slow encroachment as their tales of plenty spread eastward, luring others to the Shoshone's domain. So impressed were the trappers by Cache Valley's promise that they urged Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, to consider it as a haven for his followers. In 1847, as Young led his people westward to escape persecution, men like Bridger argued the valley's fertile soil and ample game made it ideal for settlement. Young, however, clad in a dark coat and leaning on his cane, surveyed the region and chose Salt Lake Valley instead, citing its broader expanse and strategic position. Historian Leonard J. Arrington records that Young's decision in the 18th of July 47 prioritized long-term growth over the trappers' enthusiastic endorsements. Cache Valley, for the moment, remained primarily Shoshone territory, but the seeds of change had been sown as Mormon scouts began eyeing its potential. The Mormons did not stay away for long. By the 18th of July 47, their wagons rolled into Cache Valley, and by 1856, they had established Wellsville, Utah, as their first permanent settlement. These pioneers, dressed in homespun clothes and wielding plows, built log cabins and fenced fields, claiming land the Shoshone had long relied upon. According to historian Brigham D. Madsen, the Mormon influx introduced intensive farming and grazing, with settlers cultivating crops and raising cattle on an unprecedented scale. By 1856, Wellsville alone housed over 100 families, their presence altering the valley's landscape. For the Shoshone, whose population in the region numbered roughly 1,500 per anthropological estimates, this encroachment meant shrinking hunting grounds and disrupted migration routes, setting the stage for conflict. The establishment of the California and Oregon trails further intensified pressures on the Shoshone. These overland routes, bustling by the 1840s, cut directly through Cache Valley, bringing thousands of white settlers westward. Covered wagons, driven by men in wide-brimmed hats and women in calico dresses, churned up dust as they traversed Shoshone lands. Historian John D. Unruh estimates that between 1840 and 1860, over 250,000 emigrants used these trails, many passing through or lingering in the valley. The Shoshone, once accustomed to solitude in their winter camps, now faced frequent, often hostile encounters. Livestock from wagon trains grazed on grasses the Shoshone depended on, and skirmishes over resources grew common, fraying the fragile coexistence. Brigham Young, ever the pragmatist, sought to avoid bloodshed. In his sermons, delivered in a resonant voice to congregations in Salt Lake City, he urged his followers to feed the Indians rather than fight them. This policy, articulated in 1847, aimed to foster peace through generosity. Young, often seen with a broad hat and a ledger in hand, believed sharing food could ease tensions with the Shoshone and other tribes. Historian Ronald W. Walker notes that Young's approach reflected both moral conviction and strategic necessity, as the Mormons, numbering about 15,000 in Utah by 1850, could ill afford prolonged conflict. Yet, despite his words, the sheer scale of Mormon settlement tested this ideal, as their expansion consumed the very resources Young hoped to share. In a bid to secure their rights, a delegation of 20 Shoshone leaders, adorned in beaded moccasins and carrying ceremonial pipes, met with Mormon representatives on the 31st of July, 1847. This meeting, held in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains, focused on land claims in northern Utah. The Shoshone, led by figures like Chief Sagwitch, sought assurances that their hunting grounds would remain intact. Mormon records, cited by historian Ned Blackhawk, describe the talks as tense but respectful, with the Shoshone asserting their ancestral ties to the land. The Mormons, eager to avoid hostilities, offered gifts of flour and cloth but made no formal concessions. This fragile diplomacy hinted at cooperation, but underlying tensions simmered as settlement continued unabated. The Mormon presence soon took a devastating toll on the Shoshone's resources. By the 1850s, settlers and their livestock had overrun Cache Valley, consuming vast quantities of game and forage. Deer and elk, once plentiful, grew scarce as Mormon farms expanded, with Wellsville's cattle herds alone numbering over 1,000 by 1856, per territorial records. The Shoshone, who relied on these animals for food and hides, faced dwindling supplies. Historian Newell G. Bringhurst argues that this ecological disruption pushed the Shoshone towards starvation, as their traditional diet, which Stewart estimated provided 2,000 calories daily, shrank dramatically. Families who once thrived now scavenged for roots, their winter stores depleted by the settlers' relentless appetite. In 1856, Shoshone leaders, their faces etched with worry, voiced their plight to Utah's Surveyor General. Standing before territorial officials, they explained that Mormon settlements had driven away the valley's game, leaving their people hungry. They pointed to fields where bison once roamed, now replaced by wheat and barley. Territorial reports, archived in the Utah State Historical Society, confirm their account, noting that the once abundant game no longer appeared in Cache Valley. This testimony, delivered with quiet urgency, underscored a crisis ignored by many settlers. For the Shoshone, it was a plea for survival, but their words fell on deaf ears as officials prioritized Mormon expansion over native needs. By 1859, the situation grew dire, prompting Jacob Forney, Utah's Superintendent of Indian Affairs, to issue a stark warning. In a letter to the U.S. Department of the Interior, Forney, a meticulous man often seen with ink-stained fingers, wrote that the Shoshone had been impoverished by the introduction of the white population. He documented their hunger, noting that many families survived on meager rations of berries and small game. Forney proposed establishing a reservation in Cache Valley to protect Shoshone resources, a plan he believed could prevent conflict. Historian David L. Bigler cites Forney's report as a rare acknowledgement of native suffering, but the Interior Department, distracted by national tensions, dismissed his call, leaving the Shoshone to face an uncertain future. The U.S. Department of the Interior's refusal to act on Jacob Forney's 1859 proposal for a Shoshone reservation left the tribe exposed to a deepening crisis. Forney, a diligent official with a penchant for detailed reports, had warned that white settlement was stripping the Shoshone of their means of survival. His call for a protected reserve in Cache Valley, which could have secured hunting and fishing grounds for the estimated 1,500 northwestern Shoshone, was ignored by bureaucrats in Washington, preoccupied with the looming Civil War. Historian David L. Bigler notes that this inaction reflected a broader federal neglect of native welfare, prioritizing settler expansion over indigenous rights. As a result, the Shoshone faced escalating hunger, their winter camps in Willow Valley growing leaner each year, setting a grim stage for conflict. Starvation drove the Shoshone to desperate measures. By the early 1860s, bands of warriors, clad in tattered hides and armed with bows or outdated rifles, began raiding Mormon farms and cattle herds. These attacks, often targeting livestock pens or grain stores, were not merely acts of vengeance, but survival tactics for a people pushed to the brink. Historian Brigham D. Madsen estimates that between 1859 and 1862, Shoshone raids disrupted at least 20 settlements in Cache Valley, with settlers reporting losses of over 200 cattle and 50 horses. While settlers viewed these acts as aggression, the Shoshone saw them as reclaiming resources stolen by the newcomers. This cycle of raids and reprisals fueled mutual distrust, hardening attitudes on both sides. In 1862, James Duane Doty, Utah's Superintendent of Indian Affairs, arrived in Cache Valley to assess the crisis. A seasoned diplomat with a neatly trimmed beard and a ledger always at hand, Doty spent 4 days among the Shoshone, documenting their plight. His report, preserved in the National Archives, painted a stark picture. The Indians have been in great numbers and a starving and destitute condition. He noted that previous officials had provided no aid, leaving the Shoshone to scavenge or steal to survive. Doty's findings, corroborated by historian Ned Blackhawk, underscored the federal government's failure to address the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Utah. His observations hinted at the looming violence, as hunger pushed the Shoshone toward increasingly bold actions. Doty took immediate steps to ease the suffering. He distributed sacks of flour and blankets to Shoshone families, who gathered around his wagon with weary eyes and outstretched hands. Beyond this temporary relief, Doty proposed a long-term solution, providing livestock to transform the Shoshone from hunters into herders. He argued that cattle and sheep could replace the vanishing game, offering a sustainable livelihood. Territorial records indicate Doty requested 500 head of cattle for the Shoshone, a plan he believed could prevent further raids. However, as historian Ronald W. Walker points out, Doty's superiors dismissed the idea, citing costs and skepticism about native adaptation. This rejection left the Shoshone stranded, their desperation mounting as winter loomed. The discovery of gold at Grasshopper Creek, Montana, on the 28th of July, 1862, poured fuel on the smoldering tensions. Prospectors, lured by tales of riches, flooded the region, establishing a migration trail that sliced through Cache Valley. These men, often clad in dusty coats and clutching pickaxes, traveled in wagon trains that trampled Shoshone hunting grounds. Historian John D. Unruh estimates that in 1862 alone, over 10,000 migrants used the Montana Trail, with many passing through or camping in the valley. Their presence disrupted game migrations, and their livestock grazed on grasses essential to the Shoshone. The gold rush, as Madsen notes, turned Cache Valley into a thoroughfare, intensifying competition for resources and pushing the Shoshone closer to confrontation. Salt Lake City, the nearest major trading hub, amplified the disruption. As the primary supply point for Montana's mining camps, it funneled endless streams of wagons through Shoshone territory. Merchants in sturdy boots loaded carts with flour, tools, and whiskey, while teamsters cracked whips to drive oxen along the Montana Trail. According to territorial records, Salt Lake City facilitated over 1,000 wagon trips through Cache Valley in 1862, each one further eroding the Shoshone's resource base. Historian Newell G. Bringhurst argues that this commercial traffic choked the valley's ecological balance, leaving the Shoshone to compete with settlers for dwindling food. The constant passage of outsiders turned their once quiet winter refuge into a contested frontier. The Civil War cast a long shadow over these local struggles. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln, grappling with secession, grew wary of Utah's Mormon population, fearing their loyalty lay with Brigham Young rather than the Union. Young's telegrams pledging allegiance did little to ease suspicions, as memories of the 1857 Utah War and Mountain Meadows Massacre lingered. Lincoln, often seen pacing the White House with a furrowed brow, prioritized securing the West's communication lines. Historian Leonard J. Arrington notes that federal officials viewed Utah as a potential weak link, especially with California's gold and mail routes at stake. This distrust set the stage for military intervention, with dire consequences for the Shoshone. To address these concerns, Lincoln ordered Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and the 3rd California Volunteer Infantry Regiment to Utah in 1862. Connor, a stern Irish-born officer with a neatly trimmed mustache and a penchant for discipline, was tasked with protecting overland mail routes and asserting federal authority. His regiment, comprising 800 men in blue uniforms and armed with Springfield rifles, marched from California to Utah, braving desert heat and mountain passes. According to military records, Connor's mission included monitoring both Mormon activities and native unrest. Historian Will Bagley describes Connor as a man eager for action, whose arrival shifted the region's delicate balance, placing the Shoshone in the crosshairs of a military primed for conflict. Connor established Camp Douglas on a bluff overlooking Salt Lake City in the 18th of October 62. The fort, a sprawling complex of log barracks and artillery emplacements, housed over 700 soldiers and served as a strategic hub. From its ramparts, Connor could surveil the Mormon capital while dispatching patrols to Cache Valley. Military logs, cited by Madsen, record that Camp Douglas maintained a stockpile of 20,000 rounds of ammunition, signaling its readiness for combat. For the Shoshone, the fort's presence loomed as a threat, its cannons a stark reminder of federal power. Connor's arrival, as Black Hawk argues, militarized the Utah frontier, escalating tensions that had previously been managed through diplomacy. The simmering conflict erupted in 1862 when a Summit Creek settler accused a young Shoshone Pugwany of stealing a horse. Pugwany, likely in his teens and dressed in a deerskin tunic, was fishing near the creek when confronted. Despite testimony from Robert Thornley, a local Mormon who vouched for his innocence, a hastily convened jury convicted Pugwany. He was hanged before a crowd, his body left swaying as a warning. Local records, preserved in the Cache County Historical Society, reveal Pugwany was the son of a Shoshone chief, a detail that fueled outrage among his people. Historian Rodman W. Paul notes that this incident lit a fuse, as the Shoshone, grieving their loss, prepared to retaliate, setting Cache Valley on a path to bloodshed. The execution of Pugwany, revealed to be the son of a Shoshone chief, ignited a fierce response from his people. In the days following his hanging in Summit Creek, a band of Shoshone warriors, their faces painted with red ochre and armed with bows and stolen muskets, descended on a nearby canyon. There, they ambushed several young men from the Merrill family who were gathering firewood with axes in hand. Local records, cited by historian Brigham D. Madsen, confirmed that at least 3 Merrill youths were killed, their bodies left in the snow as a stark message. The attack, as historian Ned Blackhawk notes, was not random violence but a calculated act of retribution rooted in the Shoshone's grief and their eroding trust in settler justice. This bloodshed deepened the divide, pushing Cache Valley closer to all-out conflict. Years earlier, in the summer of 1859, a separate incident had already stoked settler fears of the Shoshone. A group of 19 settlers from Michigan, traveling the Oregon Trail near Fort Hall, was attacked at night. The assailants, likely Shoshone, though never definitively identified, struck with lethal precision. Survivors, hiding among the willows along the Portneuf River, later described a scene of horror. Gunfire echoed as men, women, and children fell. Territorial reports, archived in the Idaho State Historical Society, state that 12 settlers died, with the rest rescued by Lieutenant Livingston's dragoons after 3 days. Historian John D. Unruh argues that this attack, widely attributed to the Shoshone, cemented their reputation as dangerous among settlers, despite lacking clear evidence of their involvement. The brutality of the Fort Hall attack was seared into settler memory by a chilling account in the Desert News on the 21st of September, 1859. The newspaper detailed the fate of a 5-year-old girl among the victims. Her ears were cut off, her eyes gouged out, and her legs severed at the knees. With signs she was forced to walk on her stumps before dying. This gruesome report, though possibly exaggerated for sensational effect, sent shockwaves through Utah's settlements. Historian David L. Bigler notes that such stories, whether fully accurate or not, fueled a growing narrative of Shoshone savagery, justifying calls for retaliation. For settlers, clutching rifles in their cabins, the account erased any nuance, painting the Shoshone as a monolithic threat. Tensions boiled over in the 18th of December 62, when Major McGarry, a stern officer with a weathered coat and a quick temper, led a detachment from Camp Douglas to Cache Valley. His mission was to recover livestock stolen in Shoshone raids, which settlers claimed included 150 cattle and 80 horses, per territorial records. Spotting a Shoshone band near the Bear River, McGarry's troops charged, but the warriors fled, cutting the ropes of a ferry to slow pursuit. Undeterred, McGarry captured 4 Shoshone men, binding their hands with coarse rope. When the stolen livestock wasn't returned by noon the next day, he ordered their execution. The men were shot, their bodies dumped into the icy river. Madsen calls this act a brutal escalation, one that inflamed Shoshone resolve to resist. The Shoshone's retaliation came swiftly. In early 1863, warriors ambushed a freight-hauling party on the Montana Trail, led by A.H. Conover, a burly teamster with a thick beard. The attackers, wielding lances and rifles, killed 2 of Conover's men, George Clayton and Henry Bean, as they guarded a wagon loaded with flour. Conover, escaping to Salt Lake City, told reporters the Shoshone were determined to avenge the blood of their comrades. His account, published in the Desert News, claimed the warriors vowed to kill every white man north of the Bear River until their losses were repaid. Historian Will Bagley notes that such rhetoric, while possibly embellished, reflected the Shoshone's growing militancy, driven by repeated injustices. The violence escalated further when 8 miners, trudging along the Montana Trail in heavy boots and carrying pickaxes, strayed near a Shoshone winter camp north of Franklin. Lost after missing a turn, the group, led by John Henry Smith, found themselves on the wrong side of the Bear River, unable to cross its deep waters. 3 miners swam to Richmond for supplies, but before they returned, Shoshone warriors attacked the remaining 5. Smith was killed, his body later recovered by Richmond settlers and buried in the city cemetery. Cache County records confirm the loss of 3 horses in the raid, underscoring the Shoshone's targeting of settler resources. Blackhawk argues this ambush was a desperate assertion of territorial control by a people pushed to their limits. William Bevins, one of the surviving miners, reached Salt Lake City and swore an affidavit before territorial officials. Clutching his worn hat, he recounted Smith's murder in vivid detail, describing how Shoshone warriors struck with arrows and gunfire. Bevins also reported a chilling rumor. 10 other miners had been killed on the trail just 3 days earlier. His testimony, preserved in Utah's territorial archives, painted a picture of relentless Shoshone aggression, though it likely overstated their actions. Historian Ronald W. Walker cautions that such accounts often reflected settler panic, amplifying incidents to justify military response. Bevins's words, however, carried weight, stoking demands for action against the Shoshone. The mounting violence prompted Justice John F. Kenney, a territorial judge with a stern demeanor and ink-stained cuffs, to issue arrest warrants for 3 Shoshone chiefs, Bear Hunter, Sandpitch, and Sagwitch. On the 4th of January, 1863, Kenney ordered the Utah Territory Marshal to enlist Colonel Connor's troops to apprehend the leaders whom settlers blamed for the raids. The warrants, detailed in territorial court records, accused the chiefs of orchestrating attacks on settlers and miners. Madsen notes that targeting tribal leaders was a common tactic to weaken native resistance, but it ignored the broader context of Shoshone desperation. Kenney's order set the stage for a military operation, with Connor poised to act. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, stationed at Camp Douglas, seized the opportunity with zeal. A disciplined commander who often inspected his troops with a polished saber at his side, Connor planned a surprise attack on the Shoshone camp in Cache Valley. To ensure success, he kept his preparations secret, ordering his men to move under cover of darkness. Military logs, cited by Bagley, reveal Connor's intent to avoid the mistakes of Major McGarry's earlier expedition, where the Shoshone had scattered before troops arrived. Connor's strategy, as Bigler argues, was ruthlessly efficient, designed to deliver a crushing blow. His eagerness reflected both his mission to assert federal control and a personal disdain for native resistance. At Camp Douglas, Connor's troops grew restless, their discipline fraying under the monotony of garrison life. Clad in blue wool coats, the soldiers, numbering over 700, grumbled about their posting in Utah's harsh winters. In late 1862, a group of California volunteers, frustrated by inaction, filed a petition to join the Civil War's Eastern Front. They offered to forfeit $30,000 in pay to secure naval passage, declaring they'd rather fight traitors than freeze around sagebrush fires. Military records confirm the War Department denied their request, leaving them itching for action. Madsen describes the camp as a powder keg, with Connor channeling this discontent into his planned assault on the Shoshone, a decision that would soon unleash devastation. On the 22nd of January, 1863, Captain Samuel Hoyt, a resolute officer with a weathered face and a tightly buttoned uniform, led the first wave of Colonel Connor's expedition from Fort Douglas. His force, comprising 40 infantrymen clad in heavy wool coats, marched alongside 15 baggage wagons loaded with supplies and 2 mountain howitzers capable of firing 12-pound shells. According to military records preserved in the National Archives, Hoyt's detachment, totaling 80 men including teamsters, moved deliberately through the snow-dusted Utah landscape toward Cache Valley. Historian Brigham D. Madsen notes that Hoyt's mission was to establish a forward position, setting the stage for Connor's larger assault. The howitzers, dragged by mules, signaled the army's intent for overwhelming force, a grim omen for the Shoshone awaiting them. 3 days later, on the 25th of January, Colonel Patrick Edward Connor followed with a formidable cavalry force. Leading 220 horsemen from the 2nd Regiment of California Volunteers, Connor, astride a black stallion and gripping his saber, ensured his troops traveled under the cover of night to maintain secrecy. Military logs detail the arsenal they carried: 16,000 rounds of rifle and pistol ammunition, enough to sustain a prolonged engagement, plus 200 rounds for the howitzers. Historian Will Bagley describes Connor's preparations as meticulous and merciless, designed to catch the Shoshone off guard. By splitting his forces and staggering their movements, Connor aimed to avoid the Shoshone's earlier escapes, a tactic that revealed his ruthless determination to crush resistance. The expedition endured brutal conditions as it advanced. Temperatures in Cache Valley plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, according to local settler accounts compiled by the Cache County Historical Society. Soldiers, their boots crunching through deep snow, suffered as the cold bit through their uniforms. Whiskey rations, issued in tin canteens to bolster morale, froze solid, rendering them useless. Military reports confirm that by the time the troops neared the Shoshone camp, at least 75 men showed signs of frostbite, with some unable to grip their rifles. Historian David L. Bigler argues that these hardships steeled the soldiers' resolve, but they also weakened their ranks, reducing Connor's effective force to roughly 2/3 of its original strength. Unaware of the approaching storm, the Shoshone leaders clung to hopes of negotiation. Chiefs like Bear Hunter, clad in a buffalo robe and holding a feathered lance, prepared their winter camp along Beaver Creek with minimal defenses. They wove willow branches into makeshift screens to conceal their lodges and dug shallow rifle pits along the creek's eastern bank. Anthropologist Julian Stewart estimates the camp housed 300 to 400 people, including women and children, with only about 100 warriors. The Shoshone's firearms, a mix of antique muskets and captured rifles, were no match for the army's standardized weapons. Historian Ned Blackhawk notes that their preparations reflected a fatal miscalculation, as they anticipated talks, not an all-out assault. Chief Sagwitch, one of the leaders named in Justice Kenny's arrest warrant, was absent from the camp, unaware of the impending attack. In Salt Lake City, dressed in a beaded tunic and clutching a peace pipe, he met with Mormon leaders to negotiate a truce. Territorial records indicate Sagwitch sought to prevent further violence, offering to return stolen livestock in exchange for assurances of safety. His absence left the camp vulnerable, as Bear Hunter and Sandpitch assumed command. Historian Ronald W. Walker emphasizes Sagwitch's diplomatic efforts, noting that his presence in Salt Lake City underscored the Shoshone's desire for peace, a desire tragically misaligned with Connor's plans. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, reportedly issued a stern warning to Sagwitch during these talks. Clad in a dark coat and standing in a sparsely furnished meeting house, Young declared that the Mormon settlers had suffered enough from Shoshone raids. According to a Sacramento Union report from 1863, he cautioned that further bloodshed might prompt the Mormons to pitch in and help the troops. While Young's words aimed to pressure the Shoshone into compliance, they also reflected his delicate balancing act between federal demands and native relations. Historian Leonard J. Arrington argues that Young's statement, though harsh, was a calculated attempt to avoid direct Mormon involvement in the conflict, leaving the Shoshone to face Connor's wrath alone. At dawn on the 29th of January, 1863, Major McGarry's cavalry, their horses snorting steam in the frigid air, reached the Shoshone camp along the Bear River. McGarry, a grizzled officer with a drawn saber, ordered a direct assault, his 80 horsemen charging the camp's perimeter. The Shoshone, alerted by the thunder of hooves, responded with a fierce volley from their rifle pits. Military reports, cited by Madsen, record that this initial attack faltered, with McGarry's men taking heavy fire and retreating after losing 6 soldiers. The Shoshone's resistance, though valiant, was hampered by their limited ammunition, a fact Black Hawk calls a critical weakness that doomed their defense. Connor, arriving to find McGarry's assault stalled, swiftly took command. From a ridge overlooking the camp, he barked orders to his officers, his voice cutting through the morning chill. Abandoning the frontal approach, Connor deployed flanking units to encircle the Shoshone, sending 100 infantrymen to the camp's sides and rear. A line of 50 soldiers blocked the riverbank, sealing off escape routes. The troops, firing Springfield rifles in coordinated volleys, rained bullets on the lodges below. Madsen estimates that over 5,000 rounds were expended in the first hour, shredding willow screens and hide tents. This tactical shift, as Bigler notes, turned the battle into a slaughter, trapping the Shoshone in a deadly crossfire. After 2 hours of relentless combat, the Shoshone's ammunition dwindled to nothing. Warriors, their hands blackened from gunpowder, scrambled to cast lead bullets over campfires, a desperate bid to keep fighting. Chief Bear Hunter, a towering figure with a bear claw necklace, was among those killed during this chaos, reportedly struck while molding bullets, according to settler accounts compiled by the Utah State Historical Society. The loss of Bear Hunter, a respected leader, shattered the Shoshone's cohesion. Black Hawk describes his death as a devastating blow, stripping the camp of its most formidable defender and signaling the battle's grim turn. As their defenses collapsed, the Shoshone faced a harrowing fate. Families fled toward the Bear River, its surface glazed with ice and its waters numbingly cold. Men, women, and children plunged in, hoping to swim to safety, but Connor's troops, positioned along the banks, shot them as they struggled. Military reports confirm that dozens drowned or were killed in the river, their bodies swept downstream. Survivor accounts, later recorded by Sagwitch's descendants, describe warriors fighting hand-to-hand with bayonet-wielding soldiers, only to fall in the snow. Madsen calls this phase a massacre in earnest, as the army's overwhelming firepower and sealed exits left the Shoshone with no refuge. The carnage at Bear River left a staggering toll, its scale disputed even in its aftermath. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, surveying the devastation from horseback with a grim nod, reported to the War Department that his troops had killed 224 Shoshone warriors out of an estimated 300 in the camp. Yet, settlers from nearby Franklin, who walked among the bodies in the snow, counted 493 dead, a figure that included women and children, according to records preserved by the Cache County Historical Society, historian Brigham D. Madsen notes that this discrepancy highlights the indiscriminate nature of the attack, with non-combatants caught in the crossfire. The higher count, corroborated by local testimonies, paints a chilling picture of a massacre far beyond Connor's sanitized account, exposing the human cost of his campaign. In the wake of the slaughter, Connor's troops unleashed further destruction on the Shoshone camp. Soldiers, their breath visible in the frigid air, torched 70 lodges, reducing hide tents and willow frames to ash. They seized 175 horses, vital to the Shoshone's mobility, and burned a large store of wheat, estimated at 1,000 bushels, which the tribe had painstakingly gathered for winter survival. Connor left only a small portion of grain for the 160 women and children taken captive, a meager gesture that did little to alleviate their plight. Historian Ned Blackhawk argues that this systematic destruction was designed to cripple the Shoshone's ability to recover, stripping them of shelter, food, and transport in the depths of winter. Amid the chaos, Chief Sagwitch, a resilient leader with a weathered face and a beaded tunic, defied death to preserve his people. Shot twice in the hand during the battle, he fled on horseback, only to have his mount killed beneath him. Sagwitch plunged into the icy Bear River, hiding beneath brush near a hot spring until nightfall cloaked his escape. His survival, documented in family oral histories and cited by historian David L. Bigler, was a testament to his cunning and determination. By dawn, Sagwitch emerged to rally survivors, gathering scattered families to rebuild their community. His escape, as Madsen notes, kept the northwestern Shoshone's spirit alive, a beacon of hope in a shattered landscape. Sagwitch's son, Bessup Timbu, embodied the same unyielding resilience. A young warrior, likely clad in a deerskin shirt, Timbu endured 7 gunshot wounds during the massacre, his body riddled with lead. Left for dead in the snow, he was found by family members who carried him to safety, nursing him through a grueling recovery. Shoshone oral traditions, recorded by the Utah State Historical Society, celebrate Timbu's survival as a miracle, a symbol of the tribe's enduring strength. Historian Ronald W. Walker calls Timbu's story a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of defeat, highlighting the Shoshone's capacity to endure even the most harrowing losses. The people of Franklin, a small Mormon settlement nearby, responded to the massacre's aftermath with a mix of compassion and pragmatism. Opening their log cabins to Connor's wounded soldiers, settlers provided blankets, hay, and hot meals to men suffering from frostbite and bullet wounds. Local records indicate that 49 soldiers were injured, with 7 later dying, and 75 others treated for frozen feet. Franklin residents also supplied sleighs, driven by men in heavy coats, to transport the wounded back to Salt Lake City, a 100-mile journey through snow-choked trails. Historian Leonard J. Arrington praises this aid as a rare moment of humanity, though it stood in stark contrast to the settlers' silence on the Shoshone's suffering. The Bear River Massacre marked a devastating end to the Shoshone's dominance in Cache Valley. Once a thriving hub of their culture, with an estimated 1,500 people sustaining a rich seasonal cycle, the valley became a place of mourning. The massacre, as Blackhawk argues, severed the Shoshone's cultural and economic ties to the region, forcing survivors to abandon traditional lands. The loss of leaders like Bear Hunter and the destruction of resources left the tribe reeling, their population reduced by nearly 1/3 per anthropological estimates. This tragedy reshaped the valley's future, cementing settler control at a profound cost to native heritage. In a poignant bid for survival, Chief Sagwitch and many of his followers turned to the Mormon Church. By 1873, Sagwitch, now baptized and wearing a simple cotton shirt, led over 100 Shoshone to join the Latter-day Saints, settling in a community called Washakie. This conversion, documented in LDS church records, offered access to food and protection but required a wrenching shift in identity. Historian Newell G. Bringhurst describes this move as a pragmatic adaptation, driven by the need to endure in a world remade by conquest. For the Shoshone, it was a bittersweet transformation, preserving their community while surrendering much of their traditional way of life. Colonel Connor, by contrast, returned to Camp Douglas as a celebrated figure. Hailed as a hero by his troops and California newspapers, he was promoted to Brigadier General in 1863 and later breveted to Major General. Clad in a polished uniform, Connor continued his campaigns, leading the Powder River expedition against the Sioux and Cheyenne in 1865. Military records credit him with securing federal control over Utah's trails, but historian Will Bagley critiques his legacy, noting that his triumph came at the expense of native lives. Connor's accolades, rooted in the era's expansionist fervor, masked the moral weight of his actions at Bear River. The Desert News, Utah's leading newspaper, echoed this fervor in its 18th of January 63 editorials. With a tone dripping with settler bias, it praised Connor's campaign, expressing hope that his volunteers would wipe out the Shoshone to protect peaceable citizens. The paper, read by thousands in Salt Lake City, framed the massacre as a necessary purge, ignoring the Shoshone's starvation and dispossession. Historian John D.T. Unruh condemns such rhetoric as a justification for genocide, reflecting the era's dehumanization of native peoples. This narrative, widely accepted among settlers, drowned out voices calling for justice or reconciliation. Decades later, a different perspective emerged from the Shoshone themselves. In 1918, Sagwitch's son, speaking to historians, offered a starkly different account of the massacre. He claimed 156 Shoshone died, with half the camp escaping, a figure far lower than Connor's 224 or Franklin's 493. He recounted how 2 of his brothers and a sister-in-law survived, hiding in the river's willows. This testimony, preserved by the Utah State Historical Society, challenges the inflated body counts of military and settler reports. Blackhawk praises this account as a vital native voice, restoring agency to the Shoshone and underscoring their resilience. It reminds us that history, often written by victors, must be tempered by the truths of those who endured. The Shoshone's story, as voiced by Sagwitch's son, pierces through the victor's narrative, revealing a people who refused to be erased. The Bear River Massacre, with its staggering loss of 493 lives and the destruction of a vibrant culture, stands as a haunting testament to the cost of unchecked expansion. Yet, the survival of Sagwitch, Bessup Timbu, and their kin, who rebuilt amidst unimaginable grief, speaks to an enduring spirit. Their legacy, carried forward through oral histories and adaptation, demands reflection on the injustices borne by native peoples. This tragedy, etched in the frozen banks of the Bear River, urges us to honor their resilience and confront the shadows of our past with humility and resolve.